Okay, so now we're going to talk about how to create a histogram using your graphing calculator. Okay, so go ahead and grab your TI graphing calculator, and hopefully you have your notes. We're going to use the number of texts that you send a day, data that we have when we were creating the frequency distributions in the histograms. Okay, to enter, you have to first enter the data. So all of those data points, those number of texts, have to go into the calculator. If you hit stat, right? Stat is going to be the function in which we're going to sort of live in this class. And you can see there's lots of things that we can do in this. Edit is going to refer to all of the lists that we're going to create. Calculate and tests are all, we're going to use all of these things. And you can see all the different options there. We'll get to all those later. For right now, edit is where you would go to pull up your lists. And in order for your calculator to do any of those items that we just showed, most of the time we're going to have some data typed in into a list. So at this point, I'm going to start typing in my data, right? And all we do is the first number of text messages that we have here in our data set is 400. So you just type in 400 and hit enter, right? If I arrow back up, you can see down here at the bottom where it says that the first data point in list 1 is 400. Okay. Once we've entered that in, we just continue through and enter in the rest of our data points. So 28, then 20. It doesn't really matter. Oops. Then 20. If you want to just messed up and typed in 22, you can just arrow up, type in 20 and hit enter, and it'll replace it, right? And then 60 and so on and so forth. If you want to go ahead and pause the video and put the rest of the data points in, we'll move on from there. Okay, as you can see, I have all 32 data points typed in, right? And then from here, if we go back to stat, we can sort that list in ascending order or descending order. We can clear the list. Setup editor just is kind of a way of erasing all the lists, so we don't want to do that right now. To create our histogram, we want to quit out of this. And since this is a stats class, we want to do a stat plot. So if you look right here above the y equals, there's a blue stat plot, right? That's what we want to choose. So we go to second and hit the y equals, and there are all your stat plots. You can have as many as 3 or 4 turned on if you want. Okay. If they're off, that means that the calculator is not going to try to graph any data. If they're on, then the calculator is trying to graph some data, right? So if we hit enter on the first one, remember that our list was in list 1. Okay. So we're going to turn this plot on. So we hit enter on. And then we want to arrow down. Now, when we arrow down, there are some options here on what kind of graphs to create. So we've got a scatter plot there. We've got a line graph there. We've got a histogram there. And then 2 different types of box and whiskers plots, which we'll take a look at later. And then another graph out here that we're not going to create at this time, right? So we want to choose the histogram, so we arrow over to what looks like the bar graph there. And then it wants us, the calculator needs to know where the list is, right? Where our data is in list 1. So we're good there. If we needed to change it, you would just hit shift and then whatever number. So you can see there below that there's blue L1s, L2s, L3s, L4s, L5s, L6s above the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can hit enter, and it'll change the list. But we need to be in list 1, so we're going to hit that. Now frequency, if the list 1 data shows up exactly the same way multiple times, like if I have 4 different 45s, well, that's kind of hard to explain, but the frequency is always going to be a 1 here, right? Because there's one data piece, there's one of each data piece in the list, right? So don't mess with that too much. And then we're ready to graph. You may or may not have a color option. This is for a TI color, TI-84 color version, right? So here we're ready to graph. So we just hit graph, okay? And that's what we're looking at. Okay? Now, we didn't set our window. We didn't even look to see what our window was. Normally, our window is set at a standard 10 by 10 window where we can see from negative 10 to 10 on each axis, the x and the y axis. When we graph, then the histogram is going to be graphed in that window, right? And so the window just refers to how much can we see in this guy right here. Now, we can't really see our histogram that well, and we're seeing a whole bunch of things over here that we don't need to see. So we can adjust this window. We want to scooch the window over and maybe zoom in a little bit so that we can see our histogram a little bit better. In order to do that, the easiest way to do that is to hit zoom right there at the top and go down to the option that says zoom stat. This will tell your calculator to show me the graph, but I want you to zoom in on my statistical data, right? And so it will automatically shift our window over so that we can see all of our data. And so there's our histogram, okay? And if you hit trace, we're going to see trace up there next to zoom. You can see the cursor sitting there on top of the first bar. And when it does that, you'll see some things down here at the bottom, which gives us some information. First of all, this tells us that this bar goes from 4 to 70, and that there are 16 data pieces in there, right? 16 individuals are in that class, right? Now, this is not the class that we created. This is not the width of class that we created in our histograms by hand. So that's why the histogram doesn't look like it does in our notes when we did this by hand. Okay? But from there, you can always arrow over. It'll let us know that the second bar goes from 70 to 136, and there are 10 individuals in that class. So these are all the number of text messages that were sent, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, if you don't like the way that histogram looks, if you want to create more classes, if you have a better sense of how you want your x-axis scaled, these are all things that we can change in our window option. So we hit window. And in our notes, our x-axis was scaled starting at 0.5. Remember, we subtracted a half and added a half to each end of our classes before so that our bar graphs, our histogram, would stay together. So if you look back in your notes, you'll see how that histogram was scaled on the x-axis. Well, if that was the case, then our minimum x value was 0.5. So we hit 0.5 and hit enter. Our maximum of our x-axis was 400.5. And our class width was 50. So this, if you notice, this is all on the x-axis. So we can change our x scale to 50. And when we do that, we hit graph now. And this is going to look a little bit closer to what our histogram looked like when we did it by hand. So we hit trace. So now our first class is from 0.5 to 50.5. There are 10 individuals there. I think our counts in our notes were a little bit off, but that's okay. It served its purpose. The next class has 15 individuals in it, and that goes from 50.5 to 100.5, and then so on and so forth. Okay? So we've created 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different classes, right? If you wanted to create fewer, right? If you wanted to maybe take this down to 5 or 6 classes, right? You just go back to window and you change your scale, right? If we want fewer scales, then we have to increase, or if we want fewer classes, we need to increase our scale. So maybe we increase it to 75. Now hit graph. And now we hit trace. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And you can see that our window has gotten a little bit off here. So we'd have to go in and increase our window to say maybe something bigger for 10 maybe. And now graph, oh, that's not enough. So maybe we go to say 500. There we go. Now we can see the end of that bar. Okay? So you can always play around with your histograms and try to get them to look like what you want it to give you a better idea of what your data looks like. I liked the 8 classes better. I'd probably go back to the 8 classes because it seemed to be a better graphical representation. Okay? But that's it. That's how you create your histograms.